Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Islamic Calling podcast. We're joined by brother
Boom.
MENJ. Recently, brother Ali Dawah, he made a video in regards to the scientific miracles argument. So we wanted to discuss
Of course.
this. Science. We are also going to discuss how the enemies of Islam is trying to use this.
They jump upon his statements. But to be fair to brother Ali Dawah, I don't think he meant what those Islamophobes were spreading. Cut a long story short, I did use this kind of scientific arguments for a while, but after some time I realized there are so many other things in the Quran which we can use as evidence proof that the Quran is true. We don't actually need to rely on scientific evidences. Okay. Nevertheless, I still believe that science and the Quran are congruent with each other. They complement each other. I don't think that we as Muslims should rely 100% on science to validate the Quran, because the Quran, in the end, the Quran is not a science book.
I think the way this argument is formulated itself is problematic because I don't think we're addressing the core issue here. Because I think one thing that people
Right.
misunderstand is that science and philosophy are not really different. Okay, this is something I need you guys to understand. Science and philosophy is actually not different. There are two sides of the same coin. In both cases, you have to use logic to come to the conclusion.
You have to ask what's the aim of philosophy, and it is, I think, to explore the nature of ideas, a Platonic notion, and the origin of those ideas and the distinction between truth and falsehood. How to discover facts through thinking and reasoning. There's a big overlap, of course, between physics and mathematics and philosophy, which is well established.
Right. So in Islam, we believe that there is no contradiction between. This is what Ibn Taymiyyah argued, that there is no contradiction between the akal versus the nakal.
Just to expand upon what I mean here, there is a great book by Professor Carl Sharif el-Tabdi named Ibn Taymiyyah on Reason and Revelation. In that book he summarizes Ibn Taymiyyah's position in regards to reason and revelation. He does this based on Ibn Taymiyyah's 5 to 6 volume book Refutation of the Contradiction of Reason and Revelation. In the professor's book he says the following. Ultimately, Ibn Taymiyyah seeks to resolve the conflict between reason and revelation by demonstrating that the very notion of reason employed by the philosophers and theologians is compromised, with the result that the arguments based on such reason are incoherent and invalid. His mission is to show that there is no valid rational argument that opposes or conflicts with the straightforward affirmations of revelation concerning any of the particular attributes or actions affirmed therein of God, the temporal origination of the universe, or any other topic. If Ibn Taymiyyah, as he sees it, can do this convincingly, then the famous rational objection evaporates.
Now, akal also includes science. Okay, you cannot kind of like exclude that. The science is actually part of this kind of like logical process. So I feel like the issue that I have with some of the brothers that are kind of like propagating this kind of like, science has nothing to do with Islam at all. I think that's also problematic, because like then you're excluding kind of like this kind of idea that rationality or like science itself is problematic.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree. I wouldn't agree with that as well. Yeah, I wouldn't agree that science is non-existent in the Quran. I do believe that science, in some form or another, is in the Quran, but it's not meant to be scientific. There's a difference between science in the Quran and scientific details in the Quran. Okay, there's a difference there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the way like I see it is that the way you have to understand the Quran is based on the Quranic exegetical rulings that we have, tafsir basically. So basically, you can interpret the Quran in various different ways, and you have to do it the way the Prophet ﷺ did it and his companions did it, right? Like for example, you can interpret a verse of the ayah of the Quran with other verses of the Quran, or you can look at what the Prophet ﷺ explained about the verses, or you can look at the tafsir or the commentary, So I think these are the kind of like the best way to interpret the Quran. Now, if you have a situation where the interpretation of the Quran and this type of situations does exist is aligned with science, then I think that's a problem. I think this is how like the argument usually phrased. Now, the thing is that this argument is not necessarily just about kind of like this kind of scientific miracle. It can also apply to prophecies as well. So it's like a kind of like a modus ponens argument. You can say it like this: like if the Quran contained knowledge not known to human beings at the time, then it's highly likely that the Quran was not written by human beings at the time. Written by human beings at the time. The Quran did contain knowledge not known to human beings at the time. Therefore, it's highly likely that the Quran was not written by human beings at the time. So basically, when it comes to prophecies or like this type of kind of like scientific miracle arguments, this is kind of like the basic kind of like skeleton argument that we use, right?
Yes, that's right.
Basically, we're saying that at the time, the Quran says things that was not known. For example, the war between the Byzantines and the Romans, right? It was
Yeah,
not known.
yeah.
Like no one
Very
knew
famous
who
verse.
was going to win the war, right?
Exactly.
So it was not known. Yet that's what the Quran says. And later on, we find out that that's exactly what happened. And what is the chances of that?
Exactly.
Most likely that it was from God. So you can
Yes.
use arguments like this, and you can also use this kind of argument on like this kind of like scientific things. However, the way you have to use this kind of argument, I break it down into two categories. One is the argument supported by the Quran and the Sunnah, or the like scholarly exegetical method, right? And second, and it cannot be a situation where this was already known, right? Like for example, you have a lot of situations where like a lot of kind of like quote unquote scientific information that was already known at the time. So you cannot use that argument in that cases, right? So this has to pass these two
definitely.
criteria. Now, if this argument doesn't pass these two criteria, you cannot use them.
Yeah, I have no problems with it. I think this is consistent with how I approach the Quran from a scientific point of view. Or
you do not read into the Quran. We do not make that mistake by reading, and this verse means that. Now,
yeah, that's true, and we all agree that people shouldn't like make commentary on the Quran or interpret verses of the Quran based on their own whims and desires. I think we all agree with that.
exactly.
We have to use the scholarly method and stick to that.
is there certain facts, for example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the depths of the ocean, where if you put your hand up, there are layers and layers of darkness, we can say, wow, that is very interesting, because now recent discoveries do show that. So I'm not saying totally you can't use it, but I'm saying to use science as a yardstick, this is wrong.
So I think again, like I said, I think even in this case, I think what he's trying to say is that you have to interpret verses of the Quran based on the scholarly method. And if you use the scholarly method, you will see that there are some verses that the scholars have understood that does match with science. As a matter of fact, the verse is talking about, I'm going to share some of it actually. The verse is talking about, I think it's Quran 24 to 39. Or 24 39. As for the disbelievers, their deeds are like a mirage in a desert, which the 30 perceives as water. But when they approach it, they find it be nothing. Instead, they find Allah there in the hereafter, ready to settle their account. And Allah is swift in reckoning. 24:30 it says, 24:40 it says, or their deeds are like the darkness in a deep sea, covered by waves upon waves. This is what it's talking about. Waves upon waves, topped by dark clouds, darkness upon darkness. If one stretches out their hand, they can hardly see. Whoever Allah does not bless with the light will have no light. So here, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is basically using kind of like an analogy, or so basically he's like using an analogy.
Yes.
Or he's described the ocean as, or their deeds are like the darkness in the deep sea, covered by waves upon waves, toppled by dark clouds. So here, many scholars have interpreted this, like Imam Tabari and others, and that I didn't find anyone kind of like saying that, this has any other meaning that it basically means how Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala says it means. Basically, it means that it is in a real sense, right? Of course, I think Imam Tabari, I have a translation here. He translated this using kind of like a translator, but I think you can get some idea of what he's trying to say. But if there's a mistake, please do correct me. So Imam Tabari basically explains in this ayah, as he says, and this is another parable that God sets forth for the deeds of the unbelievers. The Almighty says, and the likeness of the deed of these unbelievers, in that they acted upon error, corruption, misguidance, and confusion among their works in them, and without guidance, is like darkness in a murky sea, and attributing the sea to the deep, describing it as deep and abundant in water. The depth of the sea is mostly covered by, he says, the sea is covered by waves. He says, above the wave is another wave, and that covers it. And he says, above the second wave that covers the first wave is clouds. Now, so he made the darkness an example of their deeds, and the idyllic sea an example of the heart of the unbelievers. Now, this is actually a very beautiful kind of like verse of the Quran. Basically, what Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is saying, and if you actually understand the science behind it, it actually makes the verse even more beautiful. So basically, what Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is saying, that this believer's heart is basically like when someone is in the depth of ocean, where the ocean is very dark and you cannot even see your own hand. And over the ocean, you have waves. On top of it, you have more waves. So waves upon
Yeah.
waves, and on top of it you have
Yeah.
the sky. So
Yeah.
here it's actually a very real depiction of what the ocean is actually like in the real world.
Yes. Yes.
Because in
That's
the
right.
real world you have these things called internal waves and you have external waves. So
Yes.
once you understand that and you see that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to say, it makes perfect
Yeah.
sense. As a matter
Yeah.
of fact, it beautifies the Quran.
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. And this is actually also scientifically accurate, as the
Yeah.
scholars have explained it. So here we have a perfect combination of what science describes and what the Quran says,
Yeah.
and the scholars also describe, which is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
perfect description of how the ocean actually works. So basically, we can use this argument against atheists to
Yeah.
say that how did the Prophet know this? Like
Yeah. I
it's
mean,
not
he was
possible to
living in
say.
a desert. He was
Yeah,
living in a desert in the middle of Arabia. There was no sea
yeah,
to
exactly.
reach. So to
Yeah,
study
exactly.
even. So how would it be possible for the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to know about this description of the sea? Right.
Yeah, exactly. Let me show an article by Art Observatory. They basically explain how oceans have different layers of waves. This is from Earth Observatory. Waves above and below water. So basically, NASA, they basically took a picture of an ocean. They saw how like these waves behave. So basically, you have these internal waves that are beneath the ocean,
Yeah.
and you have
Yeah.
external waves which is above the surface. So if you look at the
Ah.
picture,
Okay.
can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. Yeah. I can
So
see
you
it.
see
Yeah.
kind of like
Yeah.
this. There's this ripple here. But
Yeah.
these are like the signs of the internal waves going down underneath the sea. And then you have
Yeah.
atmospheric waves. These are like the waves on the surface. Now, the reason why
Yeah.
this is happening is because there's a bigger waves underneath that's going on. And because this wave is
Yeah.
going downwards, this wave is moving towards this direction, it's affecting the outer water or the water on the surface. And it is resulting in this kind of like smaller kind of like ripples.
Yeah. That's
However,
right.
when it comes
Yeah.
to other waves on the ocean floor or on the upwards,
Yeah.
you have bigger waves,
Yeah.
waves like these atmospheric waves.
Internal waves form because the ocean is layered. Deep water is cold, dense, and salty, while shallower waters is relatively warmer, lighter, and fresher. The differences in density and salinity cause layers of the ocean to behave like different fluids. When tides, currents, and other large scale effects of Earth's rotation and gravity drag water masses over some sea floor formations, it creates wave actions within the sea that are similar to those happening in the atmosphere. If you were on a boat, you will not necessarily see or feel internal waves because they are not expressed at the surface in different wave heights. Instead, they show up as smoother and rougher water surfaces that are visible from airplanes and satellites. As internal waves move through the deep ocean, the lighter water above flows up and down the crests and troughs. Surface water bunches up over the troughs and stretches over the crests, creating alternating lines of calm water at the crests and rough water at the troughs. Calm, smooth waters reflect more light directly back to the satellite, resulting in a bright, pale stripe along the length of the internal wave. The rough waters in the trough scatter scatter light in all directions, forming a dark line. There are definitely ocean internal waves in this image, said physical oceanographer Nico Jones of the University of Western Australia. We have measured them off the coast of Ningaloo with instruments in the water. The different directions of the wave fronts are most likely due to the different seafloor slope directions in this region. She notes that internal waves play an important role in global ocean circulation and mixing, which is critical to understanding the ocean's role in climate and in the movement of nutrients and carbon from the depths to the surface and back. Jones and colleagues also study internal waves for their potential impact on drill rigs and other offshore structures. Yeah, there you go.
So yeah,
Yeah.
basically, the Quran is accurate in describing how the ocean actually is. So again, you can make a very good argument based on this, which is that, how did the Prophet know this?
Yeah.
Okay, bro. Thank you for joining me. I think I'll let
All
you
right.
go now. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and inshallah I'll see you guys next time. And yeah, on our next stream, inshallah. So take care. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.